Thank you very much, and welcome to this conference. My name is Janet Newsham, and I am the coordinator at Greater Manchester Hazards Centre and the chair of the Hazards campaign. And for decades, Greater Manchester Hazards Centre has supported and worked with thousands of workers across the country. We've also worked closely with unions that are represented in the engineering, aerospace and shipbuilding industries in the Northwest. And I'm saying that in particular because this conference has come about as a result of some money a grant we've got from the CSEU, which is those unions that are represented in the CSEU. And a major part of our work has always been on preventing and reducing workers' exposure to chemicals by elimination, substitution and altering processes. The title of this conference is Toxic Chemicals, Risk Prevention Through Use Reduction. And toxic use reduction, as you may know, you will know by the end of the session, is about reducing the amount and number of toxic substances to which workers are exposed based on the hazards. The law that requires this to happen in the UK is COSH, but we recognise the limitations of COSH, which is poorly enforced, and many employers are ignoring their legal duties. And as we've heard from Carol, the consequences of that are deadly. So we want to put a focus on supporting trade union and workers' actions to eliminate and reduce exposure to all toxic substances at work, to improve workers' health and those of their family members. And we're going to hear from some of the country's leading experts this morning. We're really privileged to have Dan Shears speaking to us and Bud Hudspith from GMB and the Unite, Unite. Professor Andy Watterson from Stirling University and Hilda Palmer from the Hazards campaign. But more importantly, we want to hear from you what's going on in the workplace and what is needed to support you. So to that end, I'm going to begin by inviting Bud Hudspith to speak to you. Bud's the National Health and Safety Advisor for Unite, and we're so pleased we can join us, and he's going to talk about what Unite's been doing around the issue. Sorry, can I just say before you begin, Bud, can you make sure everybody's on mute? And there'll be a chance to ask questions just after the first two presentations, and then we're going to do a breakout and then come back and have a proper discussion afterwards, after the second two. So over to you, Bud.
Okay, thanks for that. There we go. I've just got 3 slides, not too much. I mean, I've had some slight problems of getting to my files in the last 2 days, so I've just had to think of trying to remember from memory 1 or 2 things. But I think what's worth saying is that Unite and its predecessor unions have had a long history of looking at toxic chemicals and so on. And in particular, my experience initially was through the printing industry, then gradually more generally through to Unite, where I look at all of manufacturing really, and a little bit more. So tackling individual issues, and the way we've approached this is, when I think about it, has been, we tend to have individual chemicals raised with us, and so we start dealing with them. So historically, I can recall many years ago, back to the 80s, we were looking at things like benzene and toluene, glycol ethers, where there's a whole host of them, and we actually, in the union then, the print union, banned a number of glycol ethers. Methylene chloride and was another chemical we looked at closely, used a lot in paint strippers, ink strippers, and still, I mean, the sad thing about all of those is they're still being discussed in various ways. So issues we dealt with many years ago continue to haunt us. And I did recall, I don't have a copy of it anyway, I wrote an article many years ago called, and the headline was "Solvents Do Your Brain In." And I suspect the headline was better than the content, but I can't find a copy of it anyway. If anyone's seen it or got a copy, I'd be interested to look at it. And also, I did a lot of work with Hilda. We did a lot of work about substituting solvents in the printing industry, a program called Subsprint, which, I mean, it ran, I mean, Hilda remember it, it ran for a couple of years, and I mean, we had mixed success. We had some success with it, but I suspect we helped to promote an idea of moving away from solvents in the printing industry and trying to use more water-based materials. The only difficulty we had is when we started looking at some water-based materials, we discovered that some of the active ingredients that went into the water-based materials were actually problems themselves. I do recall one or two skin sensitizers that we had to deal with. But more recently, we've done a lot of work around dust. We have a system in the UK where the dust standard is a useless standard. It's hopeless, and we've challenged that, and we've actually produced material on that. So there's a reference there to a website. And I was also involved in the advisory committee on toxic substances, which sounds like a pretty good thing, isn't it? That we should be discussing toxic substances and the way we control them. But that committee was abolished by the HSE some years ago. So we don't have a forum, an official forum in the UK where unions, employers and HSE, the regulator, can actually get together to discuss toxic substances. That's now been put in the hands of so-called experts and the HSE themselves, who decide what they think they should do, with kind of passing reference to ourselves and various employers. There's a huge amount of work going on in silica that we've been involved in. Again, that's another area where the union side of ACTS, when it still existed, seriously questioned the standards that were being set for silica. And even though we objected to the standard that was set because we thought it was too high, it was still put into place. The most common problems we're facing at the moment are with REACH, which is a sort of effectively an environmental kind of set of regulations that initially came from the EU. We now have something called UK REACH. And what we're seeing through Brexit is a huge divergence now starting between the way that the UK deals with chemicals and the way that Europe deals with them. And we've got a very good example of there's a chemical called formaldehyde, and the exposure limit for formaldehyde in Europe is now lower than the exposure limit for formaldehyde in the UK. And currently in the UK, there is no system in place to set exposure limits. That used to be left for the EU to do it. Since we left the EU, we have no system for doing it. And the HSE is thinking about a system at the moment, and it looks as though whatever system they come up with is pretty much going to exclude unions and indeed employers from that process, which to me is a massive retrograde step. If we compare it to the system in Europe, there's a huge amount of involvement of the social partners in standard setting in Europe, but not in the UK. And one of the most recent ones that we've been looking at is Chromium 6, hexavalent chromium. It's a carcinogen. And what we're finding is that people who maintain jet engines and various forms of turbines are finding chromium 6 deposits on the turbines and parts of those engines. And they're there, it seems, as a result of a reaction between other chromium compounds and heat and so on. And also we can see chromium 6 still being used in some paints that are used by MOD and people like that to paint helicopters and warplanes and various things like that. So these problems don't go away. Chromium's well known, chromium 6, been around an awful long time, typically associated with problems of chrome plating. But what we find is things like that come back to haunt us, and we find other uses and so on. And just a quick mention of some of the historical problems. I mean, one of the issues I've been dealing with for the last 30 or 40 years is where we get people who have suffered or potentially suffered from exposure to chemicals in the past, And we have a major task and major difficulties in trying to connect what people have done in the past, what they might have been exposed to any current problems they may face and current diseases and so on. And that's one of the tasks that Unite and other unions, I think, perform, is trying to track back. And of course, what we know when we're doing that is it's far too late. You know, we're sort of doing things after the event. What we should have been doing was preventing the use of those materials and chemicals in the first place. And the fact we were talking about benzene and toluene, whatever, 20, 30, 40 years ago, and we're still talking about some of those, is perhaps a testament to the failure of a lot of the regulations we've got. And as Janet said, things like COSH, control of substances hazardous to health, should be a key issue in controlling chemicals, and it could be if it was properly implemented, enforced, and followed by employers who have duties under that set of regulations. But sadly, we see failures at each step, and we're not actually addressing some of those chemicals in the way we should be. So that's pretty much me, a quick gander through. But I mean, use of control of chemicals, looking at the way chemicals are used, particular chemicals or solvents in general, is a major part of the work that we try and do on behalf of Unite members.
Thank you so much, Bud. Yeah, thank you. That was really interesting and really useful as a starter for the conference. I think we're in really worrying times with Brexit, you know, and how that's going to impact on workers, and the fact that you know, there is no mechanism at the minute, you know, for a proper tripartite arrangement where workers have got an opportunity to be represented at national level alongside the employers and the HSC to make sure that, you know, these chemicals are being dealt with properly. And I mean, limitations means that people continue to be exposed, you know, the limits. So, you know, and they're deadly substances that we're talking about. So thanks very much for that. I'm going to bring in Dan now, and Dan is the is the Director of Health, Safety and Welfare for the GMB, and they've been doing some work on glyphosate where the members have been exposed. So over to you, Dan.
Thanks, Janet, and morning, everyone. Yes, I didn't want to give the same presentation effect that Bud has just given, because obviously the interests of GMB and Unite are very similar in terms of chemical safety and toxic use reduction. So what I wanted to do instead was give a case study of really what the limitations are in the system and also what can be achieved. So I've got a few more slides. They are very much a reference. I'm not going to talk through all of them, but I have copied over to Janet, and hopefully we can get them circulated as needed. So yes, this is me. It's a grandiose job title instead of a pay rise, I'm afraid, but that's where we are these days. So yes, I'm going to talk about glyphosate. Glyphosate, as many of you may know, is a very powerful herbicide. It's probably the most commonly used weed killer in the world. It's been in the system since the early 1970s. There are several issues with the use of glyphosate. It is not nice stuff. We know it causes some severe health issues. Unfortunately, the science around this has been very heavily made contentious. There's a lot of muddying of the waters, particularly by the largest chemical manufacturers around this. And it's been contentious for GMB. You know, we do have members that work in the chemical sector. We did take some internal grief when we published our guide around this, but we felt it was important to do so. Because in March 2015, so nearly 7 years ago now, IARC, which is the World Health Organization body that looks at carcinogens, decided that glyphosate probably caused cancer, specifically a cancer called non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. They based that on studies of agriculture workers, primarily in Sweden and the USA, but it was also backed up, unfortunately, on tests on animals. So there was a clear link for the first time between this chemical and adverse ill health carcinogens. But there's more than that. Apart from non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, which is a particularly nasty type of cancer, it also had concerns about stomach bacteria, and I can never get this word right, the damage it did to the gut microbiome. So that's got potential links to celiac disease, to irritable bowel syndrome. We also know it can cause kidney damage, liver damage. It can cause thyroid damage, potentially an endocrine disruptor. It's got problems if you breathe it in. If you get it in your eyes, it causes conjunctivitis. So it's not great stuff in the round, but very commonly used. many of us on the call today may well have Roundup in particular in our sheds or garages at home, you know, for weed killing in our back gardens, front gardens. So, you know, incredibly common and very typical. The challenge we had then is, well, what does that mean to GMB? Why have we got an interest in this? Well, very straightforward, actually. We've got a surprisingly large number of members that work outdoors, that work in agriculture. Yeah, we often think of toxic use reductions primarily in manufacturing and a chemical sector issue, but obviously we do use chemicals outside of those sectors. And this, for me, was a really good case study of what can be done. So we got members that potentially were getting quite large exposures, particularly the kind of spraying you can see on the picture there. And we didn't know about this adverse health condition impacts until really IARC reported. So we probably did have historically members that were developing work-related cancers, but because we didn't realise there was a link, we hadn't really explored it in any great measure. And two things happened at the same time, in effect. We had the IARC report in late 2015, and in our 2016 Congress, we got a motion very specifically telling us to work on campaigning around eliminating exposure to carcinogens. So that IARC report gave us the impetus and gave us the opportunity we needed, the evidence, to start challenging glyphosate use. And it's really important to understand that even now, the HSE, as far as they're concerned with COSH, believes as long as you've got controls in place, it's fine to use this stuff. It hasn't been banned, it isn't particularly limited in any way. It is very much the case that you will still see councils in particular spraying glyphosate, spraying Roundup. So there really was a need to look at this because the regulations weren't going to help us on this. So what did we do? Well, we did what we always do as a trade union. We wrote some guidance. We got in quite a lot of trouble for writing this guidance. Hugh Robertson, who was the TUC's health and safety officer at the time, had a similar approach to one we had from some fairly large manufacturers, saying, please take your guidance down or we'll take you to court. We didn't do that. You can still download this on the website, the links again in the presentation. Hugh and the TUC were similarly threatened. And that's generally been the response when you do raise these issues around glyphosate. It's very much a threat of, yeah, we'll take legal action, you need to take these claims down. But obviously linking it to the IARC report made it much easier to turn around and say, well, yeah, don't take it from the union. Here are the international experts that have looked at this in some detail, and there is genuine cause for concern here. You need to use a precautionary principle. So the other thing we were able to do was to use a network that we have of politicians, of primarily MPs, but crucially in this case, local councillors, because we know that some of the biggest exposures were at local authorities. So you have people that are using this stuff with abandon, not realising there were health impacts because none of the science to that point had told them there were health impacts. The manufacturers weren't going to make a point of telling people using this stuff that it may have, you know, very serious health effects. So we did start launching campaigns, not so much at a national level, but really more than anything local level around this. And that started getting people taking it up in workplaces, we started having branches discussing this, local authorities discussing this, and motions being debated actually by the councillors in councils. So one thing, you know, obviously is to say, look, you're a problem here, but you have to be able to give people solutions as well. It is about reduction, and that means substitution in this case. And the great thing about this is there are plenty of things that you can do to kill weeds that don't involve spraying them with chemicals. Now, obviously, certainly the last couple of years with COVID and lockdowns, one thing that councils have been able to do is actually just to let things grow. And there has been some benefit into having rewilding. But outside of that, there are other options. I won't go through them all here now. And some of them obviously do have health and safety implications, particularly if you're using hot water or other chemicals. But ultimately, there were things that could be very easily done in terms of substitution that didn't involve high cost, that certainly had health benefits, and that didn't mean ultimately that you were not exposing the workforce, but also you weren't exposing the public to this stuff. So a lot of this was just making sure that people were aware that actually there are alternatives here. Just because you've done things a certain way doesn't mean you wanted to do things that way. And actually, with a little bit of creativity, a bit of research, you can look at genuine alternatives. So this list is from the GMB guidance, but it's adapted from the Pesticides Action Network. And I'd really recommend people take a look at that because there's a lot of very good information on there about alternatives around this. And the net effect of that, I mean, we can't take credit for all of this by any means, but I'd like to think that we helped start the conversation around it. Again, this is taken from PAN, but now 40 councils in the UK have effectively either banned or committed to take action on glyphosate use. So Glastonbury were the first, and Chelmsford were the most recent. Guildford is near me in Surrey, and we're continuing to push this stuff. You know, we know that there are workers still being exposed. There've been huge cases in America where people have developed non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, and some of the payments that have been made to those workers have been incredibly high, you know, hundreds of millions of dollars in some cases. The thinking, if you go back to the earlier picture, is that where people are spraying, it's getting into the atmosphere and it's being absorbed into the back of the neck in many cases, because that's exposed and that's where the chemical is entering. And I suspect in some cases it isn't just the great arguments that G&B have made or the council have made. It's also a bit of a fear of litigation down the line that employers will be sued if there is a link proven in this country. So we're not at the end of the challenge by any means, but there is, I think, a genuinely good news story here about what can be done. And it is, just to say, wider than just the chemical sector, the manufacturing sector. Almost every sector, whether it's this kind of agricultural spraying, whether it's the use of cleaning products in offices for cleaning, there will always be opportunities to look at what's being used. And also, I think, to challenge some of the information we get from manufacturers, because as Bud said, a lot is now being made contentious because of changes to REACH. And we shouldn't be reliant necessarily on COSH to help us out here. It's not always our friend in these circumstances. And just to conclude, Janet, by saying there's some further information there. I say our glyphosate guide is still available online. The TUC report is also there online. There's a very good piece in Hazardous around this. It's not specific on glyphosate until the very end of the article, but it does give some really good detail about chemical regulation. And it actually links to a lot of what Bud was saying earlier on about the way that the unions have effectively moved out of this space. And I certainly recommend PAN from the US, the Right to Know. They've done good work there. The Detox Project have done a lot of good work around the use of glyphosate and trying to move away from it. And I haven't put the link up. There's a very good couple of books by a woman called Carrie Gillam from the States, particularly looking at glyphosate and the role of Monsanto in this, I certainly recommend. But the final point I will make, and I'd recommend if people get a chance to look at this, the Work and Pension Select Committee have been taking evidence recently about HSE's role in asbestos regulation. And one of the questions they were asked is, why is there no work representation on the Workplace Health Expert Committee, which is the expert committee that, as Bud alluded to, replaced ACTS, the Advisory Committee on Toxic Substances. And HSE's Chief Scientist, Andrew Curran, turned around and said, well, no trade unionists, no work reps have applied for a position on that committee. The reality is we were explicitly told you can't do that. This isn't a tripartite committee. It was not appropriate for work representatives or trade unions to be involved. So it is very much the case the regulations and the regulator at this point are not going to be our friends around this and not going to be helpful to us. So we have to take action where we can on our own. And as I say, hopefully this is a good case study of how that can be done. So yeah, that's it from me. Please do feel free to use the slides and the evidence. And yes, thank you for the invite, Janet. It's been good to catch up with people.
Thank you so much, Dan. That was really interesting and really good case study, you know, how we can make a difference, you know, in the workplace. I mean, we shouldn't forget, you know, this is not just a workplace issue, it's in glyphosate, you know, this is an environment issue, and, you know, and that's impacting on all of us and all our children, anybody playing in playing fields, etc., you know, so a community issue. But, you know, when we talk about chemicals in the workplace, you know, this is this triple jeopardy on workers. It's not just the workplace, it's the chemicals in our environments, and it's the chemicals at home as well, you know, and that toxic soup, as Hilda calls it, you know, of chemicals is having an impact, and it's never really analysed properly and prevented. And I think, you know, you mentioned about the commercial interests, you know, certainly in asbestos, you know, the commercial interests have meant that workers have that people have continued to be exposed to asbestos, you know, and there's a whole industry, isn't there, a whole black industry really around, you know, making it out to be safe and, you know, and countering that. And that's the same for a lot of these products, you know, these chemicals. What we need is, you know, that balance of what the effects are in terms of workers, so that we can have a say. And that's why it's wrong that the HSC are moving in this way. Is there any questions that anybody would like to ask? I know Dan's got to leave shortly, but any questions on what Dan said or what Bud said? You can put your hands up, or you can put electronic hand up, just as clarification. Yeah, Helen.
Hi, thanks very much, Dan and Bud. That was really interesting. And I'm just wondering, because with the Hazardous campaign and some of the other, they're not environmental NGO, well they are, but it's looking at the kind of chemical exposure in the environment, but also intrinsically linked with occupational exposure. We're trying to lobby and campaign the DEFRA and HSE for a really good, strong UK reach. And I'm just wondering how UK trade unions can get involved more on this. Like I say, Janet's involved now, but we really need that kind of strength of the unions behind this as well to really push it.
Thanks, Helen. Dan, do you want to say anything about that?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question, Helen. I'll be frank at the moment, saying there are two of us nationally in GMB that deal with health, safety and environment, and we are both still just dealing with COVID more than anything. Every time we think we've got some space now to do other things, you get a new variant come up with a new wave. And it is at the moment just trench warfare with employers to try and keep measures in place. But I'm hoping that will recede, and then we will have space for this. We were very involved with the Labour Party in particular about the implications of region coming out of the European Union before sort of Brexit actually happened. And we didn't pick up those conversations again. Bud alluded to it earlier on, there are real issues here about not just regulation, but actually the ability of the HSC to take proper enforcement action where needed and to have a proper overview on this stuff. So we have got real concerns about this. It is work we need to pick back up on. The other thing that might be worth doing, Helen, is having a chat with Shelley Asquith at the TUC, because obviously Shelley will have an involvement with this as well. And the other thing I think is probably worth saying on that point is, and this may not be too common knowledge, but we've only got 2 trade union health and safety board members at the moment for HSC. So the TUC nominee, Kevin Rowan, came off before Christmas and hasn't been replaced. So at the moment, it's even more of a struggle to get these kind of issues on the board of the HSC's agenda because you've only got the 2 people there. So there are real concerns about this. The move has definitely been away from involving the consultative trade unions, as Bud said, and we're seeing that really sharpen up at the moment. So yeah, there is definitely work we can do. Very happy to try and do that. It's just that I'm not having the time to do it.
Thanks, Dan. Bud?
Yeah, I agree with Dan. I mean, I think he's right that COVID has created this sort of 2-year hiatus, really. And I think one of the things that we've been doing is looking back to what were we doing in January 2020 and February, because that's where we need to get back to. And happily, although COVID is still with us and we're still dealing with lots of COVID issues, lots of committees, queries, issues are coming back to non-COVID health and safety issues. So we are starting up again. I think the one thing I would say is that although the formal structures are disappearing in terms of involving unions, what we are able to do, and I think Dan's very much in the same position too as our other unions, we still have quite good contacts within HSE, that maybe on the less formal level. So, for instance, I mentioned formaldehyde and the process of setting limits. What I've been able to do is at least identify what's happening in HSE and who's doing it. It doesn't mean we'll get a satisfactory outcome, but we do have ways of getting in amongst them. And for all the problems we have with HSE, there are still people within HSE who are very sympathetic to what we're trying to do and what unions are trying to do. So there is, I wouldn't say it's hopeless. There is some hope there, but we need to reestablish some of these setups. And we've been pushing very strongly for the re-establishment of the Advisory Committee on Toxic Substances or something similar to address that. And I mean, I know Andrew Curran, who's, Dan mentioned his comment about no unions applying. It was quite clear that because of the criteria they set down for WEC, most unions could not apply, in fact. And we did have people who were qualified, who were scientific experts, who were sympathetic to unions, and even they were excluded from the process. So, it's a bit mealy-mouthed from Andrew to say that we didn't apply. WEC doesn't work very well. It takes too long to do anything, and we don't have much confidence in it. But there we go. Janet, I can't hear you.
That's because I didn't press the button. So, sorry, just the last question before we move on the agenda. Ian, you wanted to ask a question?
Yeah, thanks, Janet. Good morning, everyone. Thanks to Bud and to Dan for the presentations. Obviously, I'm Health and Safety Officer for Unison in Edinburgh branch, and I've been doing a lot of work on asbestos and silica over the last few years within our estate. We have buildings, both commercial and in the housing stock that still have a lot of asbestos contained within it, and also more recently there's been issues in potteries and in stone cleaning or stone cutting if you're working on roads with regards to silica. Biggest majority of my work at the moment over the last 2 years has been with COVID. And interestingly enough, I had a question sent to me yesterday about the use of formaldehyde in cleaning materials, which I was having to deal with. But yeah, I found it really interesting. But the other thing I wanted to say, particularly to Dan, is that I've been working closely with Kath Jenkins for Hazardous in Scotland with glyphosate, and we've looked at a number of alternatives actually staying Midlothian, and I know that Midlothian is one that's on the list as looking at alternatives, and believe me, you can see the difference when they're not spraying. But I've got to say that some of the alternatives that have been looked at in Edinburgh and at Midlothian have not been effective at all, and basically they're taking the heads off of weeds, but they're not actually effectively killing them. So I think more research has to be done in the line of finding an effective alternative to glyphosate. But thanks for the presentation.
Thanks, Ian. Do you want to say anything, Dan? I mean, it wasn't so much a question, but a statement. But did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I mean, just actually a couple of things, Janet, very briefly. Yeah, I mean, it is a bit of a mix and match approach in terms of using other techniques. We've always been clear that it's not necessarily going to be that you replace glyphosate with steam or vinegar in some cases. It is going to be a different approach for different circumstances. And we do know that, to Ian's point, there has been kickback. Some councils did, initially take glyphosate out. They let things rewild, or the view was it hasn't been so effective, and because of public complaints, reintroduced it. So part of this is about looking at what works best in the circumstances. But I do come back to this point that actually, if we do see the kind of cases in the UK that we've seen in the States, then potentially councils, if they do keep using glyphosate or indeed reintroduce it, are leaving themselves wide open for a claim, particularly if someone develops non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. Because we've seen huge class actions in the States on that, and effectively it's the same product being used in the same way. So there will be issues. So I think the advice I would give there is perseverance more than anything. The other thing I want to mention, Jane, because I'm going to have to go unfortunately in a minute, is there are a couple of really good books on this question of how much do industry know and why is it the mortars are often muddied around this. The classic one is The Secret History of the War on Cancer by Deborah Davis, which I'd certainly recommend. That's a very good read. And the other one is a book called Merchants of Doubt, which is primarily by Naomi Oreskes. That's about 10 years old now. And that talks about everything, the second book, from like tobacco smoke to global warming. And it really does give out industry's game plan on how you can muddy the waters on these things, make it difficult to regulate. And it's all important context. I'm not a great believer in conspiracy theories, but I think there's a lot of evidence to suggest, particularly with what's happened with glyphosate, that actually there has been corporate meddling. The public health is not at the forefront of these decisions. And as you said, Janet, we need to know the full information to be able to assess appropriately. And actually getting access to that information really is a challenge in itself. But no, unfortunately, I have got to go. There's a lot of other things to do today. But thanks very much for the invite, and I hope the rest of the conference goes well. And yes, good to see everybody.
Thanks, Dan, and hopefully we'll be working with you on this topic in the future. But is there anything else you just wanted to add before we move on to the agenda? No. Hopefully you can stay around and support it for a while. Right, so our next speaker is Professor Andy Watterson from Stirling University. We're really pleased that he's been able to join us. He's an occupational expert at Stirling, and has been working with the Hazardous campaign for years, and fantastic through the work that he's been doing over the last, certainly over the last 2 years on COVID and supporting us. And he's going to talk about Massachusetts and what toxic use reduction looks like. And I think you'll find this a really interesting example of how it can be developed, further than just the COSH, but actually, what we could be doing in terms of laws and available data and that sort of thing. So over to you, Andy. Who's going to try and share his screen? That's brilliant. Thank you. can't hear you. That's it.
Okay, can people see that? Yes?
Yes.
Yep, okay. Thank you very much for the invitation. Very happy to talk about this. It's really looking at what sort of approach exists. Janet referred to laws and regulations. I think it's fair to say that there might be a chance in Scotland and Wales of getting a Toxic Use Reduction Act through, but I doubt it in England, certainly not at the moment. So it's more about the approach. I mean, we hear a lot about concerns with regard to exporting hazardous substances. Well, this is one of those rare examples where we may be looking at what comes the other way, where we can import solutions and information. Dan just briefly touched on that. So what happens to US workers happens in the same way to UK workers. There's no difference. Okay, so a lot of it revolves in the US around this act that's 30 years old now, and was passed in the state of Massachusetts. I'll refer to it as TURA as we go along, the shorthand. And it was based on a fair amount of research and information that had gone on before. And the particular goals were to try and cut byproduct waste. So Janet referred and Helen referred to the links between workplace and the environment and broader public health. This is certainly a law that makes that particular link. So the idea was to chop byproduct waste. It was to establish toxic use reduction as a particular strategy. And like Dan and like Bud, I've always been concerned with setting tight standards, getting them in regulations, and then making sure that they're enforced. Ironically, this is about something rather different, because in Massachusetts, they still have the state and the federal laws that deal with occupational health and safety. But the ideas behind this act were actually to get compliance by working in a different way. So it doesn't mean you ignore the health and safety issues. They're actually built into it, but it's another way of dealing with it that may sometimes appeal to government and also to employers, be they private or public. And in that sense, therefore, it's got quite a lot going for it. And it was about promoting the competitive advantage as well as in terms of the industry. And that would apply in the public sector too. In other words, you're spending less money on nasty things, you're getting rid of them, you keep the workers at work, you benefit the environment. So the strategy was, let's reduce production and use of toxic chemicals. Now, what's really intriguing about this was that it's been going for 30 years, and in this state, there have been Democratic and there have been Republican governors. None of them wanted to repeal the act. So it actually was something that a range of parties could support. They didn't see it as being a threat. They saw it as being a benefit. And that may be something in terms of working it through in particular workplaces as well. So the idea was to pick out those organizations that were using high amounts of hazardous chemicals that were on a list, and basically to work through how you might remove them. There was something like 1,400 chemicals originally on the list. Doesn't mean they were all used. In fact, only about 250 were used. And the crunch comes with, did this particular measure work? And it was phenomenally successful. It is phenomenally successful. It's still going. So at the bottom of that slide, you can see the figures for a 20-odd year period, 25-year period. Within Massachusetts, the companies were able to chop toxic chemical use by 2/3. They were able to chop byproduct production by almost 3/4, and they were able to reduce on-site releases by 92%. that is incredibly successful. Of course, it's a relatively small number of companies that were doing this, or organizations that were doing it. But nevertheless, you can't say it doesn't work in that setting. So the idea was, you got the Act, the state then produced an Office of Technical Assistance, which was a structure, and again, we've already heard that the sort of setup for dealing with chemicals in the UK has gone. But here they were specifically looking at how can we deal with these toxic substances. So they had engineers, they had policy experts, they had people concerned with communication, and so on. A range of key groups were working in that state office. And it linked in with the Toxics Use Reduction Institute, which is a research body that's established at the University of Massachusetts. So what it's actually produced is a set of tried and tested principles that can be put into practice that protects workers, protects the climate, and protects wider environmental issues. It isn't about regulation and inspection and fines. The companies have to pay into the scheme, but that's all that happens. But then they get lots of information out of it. And so what we've effectively got is a rare example of a win-win-win, where you're cutting the hazardous substances, you're benefiting the workers, you're helping the employers, and you're going to improve the environment. And in the context of where we are in 2022, in terms of the challenges from climate change and so on, that's a perfect combination. And lots of organisations, be they private or public, would like to have that sort of a label attached to them. So there are always problems about reinventing the wheel. And there are always problems about whether or not we're actually accessing the latest information, and then whether or not we're acting on it. So we could be sat in Manchester, we could be sat in Edinburgh, we could be sat in Cardiff, and we can actually access the information that this Act has produced, worked examples of how it operates. I know Janet will make available the PowerPoints, but there you could just click on that web link and you would get a whole mass of information about what's going on. And they have tools as well that can be used that probably are very similar to the sort of things that Dan and Bud were talking about in terms of the process they go through. But they've got information on file, they've got safety data sheets about substances, they've got raw data, the research data, not necessarily the industry data, that they can draw on. And that then allows them to work out a hazard matrix and score substances. And in addition to that, they've got support groups. And on the right-hand side there, you'll see they've got ones for electronics, they've got wire and cable. Just thinking of who's listening to this particular conference, they've actually got aerospace group there as well, and various other pretty large companies that have bought into this. So this is information, again, that very often you can quite simply access by going on the web. And one of their concerns was that you want to avoid regrettable substitutions in the process. So you want to be benefiting worker health, you want to be benefiting public health, you want to stop adverse environmental impacts. And those three things together were what they were looking at. And again, we've heard an example, you get rid of solvents in paint and you use water, and all of a sudden you discover that there are different additives in there that aren't what you want. The Germans coined this phrase, regrettable substitutes. So it's about avoiding jumping out the frying pan into another frying pan, or jumping out the frying pan into the fire, or jumping out the frying pan and not knowing where you're going to go. So it's about doing thorough research on the information that's available to make the assessments for toxics use reduction. And this is a list of some of the sectors where they've been operating. It's not exhaustive, But you can see it covers the food industry, it covers printing, it covers engineering, it covers the green sector in terms of energy conservation, water conservation, and so on. So there are lots of examples that, in fact, we can draw on. And I'm just very briefly going to give you three, which I think illustrate the approach. So the first thing to do would be to try and remove the hazardous substance if you can. Not always possible. In other words, you don't need to look for a substitute, you can simply get rid of it. And there was a great deal of concern about BPA, there still is. And there was a lot of suggestions, well, if we get rid of BPA, we can use BPS. That will solve all of the toxicity problems. And this is out the frying pan, either into another frying pan, or we know not where. So at Lowell, in the Toxic Use Reduction Institute, they had a look at BPA and they had a look at BPS. And then they asked some basic questions, and it wouldn't apply to all sectors, but they were saying, well, for instance, why are you using BPA, BPS to print receipts? You don't always have to. If you don't print them, you've not got the problem. So for them, that was an example of removal, but they did it on the basis of finding out what was in the product, getting the data sheets, assessing the research. So as with all things, there are other products available. And Bud mentioned Subsport, which comes out of the European Agency for Safety and Health. And they were doing work at the time on BPA, but you couldn't find any information there on BPS. They weren't as thorough, they weren't as extensive. They may be very good on other things. Could also look at ChemHat, which is perhaps a much better example that came from the trade unions. And you can find information on bisphenol S there. Again, simply by going on the web, click of a button. And they gave some evaluation, not as thorough, I think, as the Toxic Use Reduction Institute ones, but nevertheless, pretty thorough. You can see there are a range of adverse effects from this substance that you would need to assess. So ChemHat, for instance, have got these very quick examples as well. I thought it's worth dropping in. So in the 1970s, they wanted to get rid of benzene, produced another chemical that was highly hazardous when they were decaffeinating coffee. They found that they could use water or carbon dioxide, simple solution. You could use a better plastic, a less hazardous plastic, or in production processes, you could simply change your production process. So TURI and ChemHat thinking is very similar. Okay, so that's one example of removal. Another example would be substitution, and this can't be done easily. So the TURI started to work under the TURA with an aerospace company that was actually making various devices, supplies, capacitors, and they needed to degrease them. So the support agency for the company went through a whole set of hazardous substances and scored them, whether they were very hazardous, moderately hazardous, or low hazard. And they were able to identify a much less hazardous substance, a much less hazardous substance as a substitute. So there's some details about it. They were able to save space, save material use. They were able to reduce hazardous air emissions. They were able to improve health and safety. They were able to make the job easier as well. And actually the company became an exemplar and was used by an equipment manufacturer. So they actually were able to sell more goods and therefore make more money. Worker, employer, public health, environment benefits. And the third one's where they look at reduction. So you can't get rid of everything necessarily. So there was a small company that was anodizing aluminium parts for the electronics industry and others. TURI had a look at it, had a look at the use of acids. They installed they proposed an acid filtration system in the anodizing process. And again, the company was able to greatly reduce what it was using. So it was saving money, it was improving health and safety, and making a positive contribution to the environment. There are endless other examples as well that I won't go into detail on, and it illustrates how carefully the research was done. So TURI were able to draw on, for instance, dealing with PFAS, which is now of great concern, a whole set of research findings that allowed them to produce much less hazardous materials, benefited the workers in the manufacturing process, and down the line would benefit the consumers. So coming to an end very quickly then, what we need is an approach that will link knowledge, information and regulation. This sort of thing came in the Danish toxics policy. There's perhaps the other alternative example to the Toxics Use Reduction Act. But the Danes were particularly concerned that you could get a load of knowledge and nothing was happening to it. So it was how you got the information out and how you linked in that to regulation. And again, if we're making a comparison with the UK, you'll see on the knowledge generation side that they actually set up a centre for substitution, really looking at the toxic use reduction strategy. We don't have anything like that here. And if we don't use the knowledge that's there, we're going to be in big trouble. Sorry, have I chopped it off? So just to finish then, there's an example of where the industry was told 4 or 5 years ago about the hazards of endocrine disruptors, and it actually did nothing. So we've got an example of an institute that works. We've got an example of legislation that works, but it's highly unlikely we're going to get that. What we can do, though, is draw on the information and the tools and some of the solutions that they produced. And in the PowerPoint, I've pulled some of this information together with Ian Tasker and Kathy Jenkins from the Scottish Hazards and with Hilda as well, to look at the sort of strategic approach, but also to give you information about the sources of information. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Andy. That was really useful, really helpful, and informative. And I think, you know, one of the things that surprises me when you're talking about this is that the benefits of these things, you know, of doing that sort of work, is never really exposed much, like, you know, given much exposure. I mean, I think about the till receipts, for example. You know, you go to get your receipt in the supermarket and they say, do you want an electronic copy of it? And then that's it, isn't it? There's no conversation. There's no information about whether there's a reason for that. You know, it's not just about reducing money, but it could be about, you know, it should be about reducing and helping people's health. You know, and then I think, you know, and also I'd be interested to see what they do in the Institute about highlighting the health impact of it. You know, you talk about the reduction in chemicals, etc. But actually, what's been the health impact of doing that, and is there information about that in the Institute? And I think that would be really useful. But I think probably moving straight on to Hilda, who's going to look at more about the workers. You know, I mean, we can see how it can be achieved, and then what we want to know is, as workers, what we need to be doing really in a practical sense. So to you, Hilda. You're on mute, Hilda. You're still on mute.
Sorry, I've stopped sharing to unmute. Okay. Share. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Thank you for that, Janet. Thank you for saving me from that. Why am I not in there? Yep. Okay. Right, I want to save. How do I get out of that? How do I do the slideshow?
Go to slideshow, yeah.
Yeah, I want to show. Okay, I know, but I can't get into it because all the bits are over the top and I can't see which one it is. Yeah, could you do it?
No, it doesn't let me do it.
I'll let you do it. Can you all see that then?
Yeah, we can see the main screen, but with the slides down the side, it'll be the same one.
Is that? I probably will have to just carry on with that. Is that okay?
That's fine.
Yep. Okay. Sorry, I can't find the start thing. It's under the under this band at the top. Okay, that's fantastic. Thanks ever so much for everybody who's already spoken. It's laid everything down very brilliantly. I'm just going to talk very quickly about what we can actually do about it at the moment and what we need to sort of talk about now in terms of making this all a great deal better. In the chat, you'll find a longer version of this with more details and more links, so you can go to that, but I'm just going to give a shortened version of it now. But basically, just we live and work in a toxic soup of chemicals that we know very, very little about. We're exposed to them at work, at home, everywhere, but we don't know what they are, and we don't know the effects of them. And whenever we get ill, you know, we can't actually prove what caused any problems, and there's very little being done about trying to prevent this. And that's why trying to prevent toxic exposures by getting toxics out of production, out of the workplace, out of products, so that toxic chemicals don't get into the air and the water and the soil as pollutants. They're not in products, they don't get into our homes, into other people's workplaces, is really the only way to do this. Workers are the canaries. Workers are exposed first, often exposed most, and considered last. Exposure levels for particles and nitrogen dioxide and other pollutants are set much lower for the environment and for the public than they are for workers. And the lowest paid workers are the most at risk and multiply exposed to toxic substances everywhere, at work, at home, when they're commuting, where they live next to the most polluted roads, near existing polluted workplaces and old contaminated land, and their children go to school in the most polluted areas. So toxic substances in air pollution, including airborne pandemics like COVID, climate change, plastic and other pollution, and the effects on workers and the public are all linked, and they're a trade union issue. We're told all the time that our health problems are caused by our own lifestyle. We're too fat, lazy, we eat all the wrong things, we smoke too much and drink too much, and it's all our own fault. But 20% of cancers we think are caused by work and the environment. And the substances that you're exposed to at work and in the environment cause every type of cancer, heart, lung, and diseases of every other organ in the body. They cause reproductive problems. The fertility rates of men is going down massively because of exposure to endocrine disrupting chemicals. And endocrine disrupting chemicals are causing autoimmune illnesses and obesity and diabetes, which are all blamed on our own lifestyle, but are actually very probably due to what we're actually exposed to in the air at work and in the environment. So we need collective integrated action that's been very clearly described by Andy particularly, but by all the other speakers, to get those toxic substances out of our lives at source. And that will be done in a way, you know, using the toxic use reduction approach to create decent jobs and decent lives. It increase equality and make sure that the transition to a cleaner, greener, fairer world is actually just, and it cuts inequalities in health and wealth. And safety reps' roles is very much about organizing that issue. Right, let's go on to the next one. Okay, so the trade union principles on exposure and control of hazardous substances is always precautionary. Use what the, you know, even if we're not clear about chemicals, we know that being exposed to the least level possible is going to be the safest. Remember that the legal official limits, the work environment limits, are not safe health-based limits. They're only limits for about 500 chemicals, not for the majority that we're exposed to, but they're based on what can be technically achievable and economically feasible. They're not for the good of our health. No hazard, no risk. If we need to eliminate, substitute or control at source, personal protective equipment only is a last resort. And always look at collective protection versus individual protection and avoid the focus on lifestyle issues. Andy has talked about intelligent substitution based on the hazards of the class of chemical rather than the risks. But always when you're substituting, you have to check what new risks could be created. And as Andy and Janet have just highlighted, we always need to be asking, do we need to do this? Do we need to use this hazardous substance? Could we do it in some other way? So we can use the law. We have the safety reps and safety committees regulations, which give union safety reps enormous rights to access to information, to ask questions, to be consulted, to be involved in risk assessments and all the rest of it. And we must use those to the full. The Health and Safety at Work Act puts a duty on all employers to ensure that workplaces are as free from risks to the health, safety and welfare at work of employees and others as is reasonably practical. That's a really broad general duty, which we should use a lot more. Then we've got the management of health and safety at work regulations, which specify suitable and sufficient risk assessments, safe systems of work, a clear hierarchy of control and fitting the work to the worker, and then specific regulations, control of substances hazardous to health, COSH, and asbestos and lead regulations. And then there are environmental standards, air pollution limits. The UK limits are not as good as the WHO standards, which we should be asking for. And there are environmental limits for nitrogen dioxide, particulate matter 10 microns and particulate matter 2.5. And they're better than the occupational levels, and we can use them and bring them into our work. Now, the control of substances hazardous to health regulations is actually a good piece of legislation. There are great limitations with it. It's risk-based rather than hazards-based, which the toxic use reduction approach is, but it's often used in a very rubber stamping exercise. You know, we're going to use these substances, and as long as we can sort of keep them under control, keep them more or less under the WEL, the work exposure limit, it'll all be okay. And this really isn't good enough. And of course, they're very, very poorly enforced by the HSE or local authority inspectors, particularly the hierarchy of control, particularly elimination and substitution. Those questions aren't asked. It's we're doing the work this way, we're using these toxic substances, let's just keep them below the levels. And that's what we've got to get away from, I think. But essentially, your employer is under a duty to assess all the substances that you're exposed to see if they're harmful to your health. And if they are, and that can be anything from being irritant or corrosive, causing asthma, causing skin harm, to cancer, endocrine disrupting chemicals, reproductive hazards, or carcinogens, any of those, any harm at all. Then they have to do something about removing that exposure. So they must identify all the substances used at work or arising in the course of work. And that's everything, dust, fumes, gases, byproducts. And it's in all workplaces, and your employer should be carrying out some air monitoring. What's in the air? What size are the particles? What are the hazards? They must assess the risks, and then they must eliminate or substitute with safer substances. And Andy has talked about that. If they can't do that, but only if they can't do that, are they then to look at engineering and other controls to prevent the exposure of all workers, things like local exhaust ventilation, better overall ventilation, air filtration, all the things that COVID has actually put a focus on, and only as a last resort to use personal protective equipment. Okay, so what do you have to make a list? You have to carry out an audit of your workplace for the processes and the chemicals used. Make an inventory, list all the substances, those that come in and out of the work in containers with labels and material safety data sheets and signs, those that are, and that can be anything from the mercs, the mutagens, endocrine disrupting chemicals, reproductive toxins or carcinogens, solvents, pesticides, minerals, plasticizers, flame retardants, polyfluorinated alkyl substances, all those sorts of things. Things that come from the fabric of the building, the upholstery and the furniture, volatile organic chemicals, formaldehyde from MDF furniture, asbestos, flame retardant, all those things. And then those things that arise in the course of the work, which are often ignored, silica dust from cutting things, diesel from vehicles on site, welding fumes, and then what's going on outside for drivers and outdoor workers, and not to forget microbes and viruses. And use the SRSC regulation rights to get access to all this information, and use other tools, the do-it-yourself work that Hazards magazine has produced to help you with this. The mapping out the work hazards, where are the exposure levels, what are people exposed to, who's exposed, how much in different parts of the workplace. Carry out body mapping, what is harming you and how is it harming you. So do those sorts of things. Use stuff that's already been done for you. Check that whether your work uses chemicals and processes that are acknowledged to cause cancer. Hazards magazine has got a fantastic updated bibliography on work cancers and a great map to show you that you can use there. and basically put it all together in an action plan. So you find out what's going on, you talk to workers, you carry out inspections, surveys and mapping. You ask your employer for monitoring. If they haven't done any, you get them to do it. You map out the work hazards, you use the body mapping, you consult the safety data sheets, you make a list of the substances, you get help from Hazards Magazine, from your union, from the HSE, from Toxic Use Reduction Institute, from all those other sorts of places that Andy has talked about. You use the law as you can, and then you look at who's exposed, how and where, and you make sure you're covering all the areas of the work, indoors and outdoors. Is there any gardening work? Are people exposed to pesticides? Don't forget the cleaners, don't forget night workers, all those sorts of things. And you make sure you have checked on all of those. And you check, are people exposed by inhaling it, by ingesting it, or through their skin? And look at things like age, sex, gender. There are different effects of chemicals on men and women, different effects on the sperm, the eggs, and the developing fetus. Women often have twice the exposure to cleaning chemicals and other things because of the gender stereotypes and the sort of work they do at home as well as at work. So you look at all of those sort of things and develop a plan. Eliminate or control the most hazardous first. I won't go into that because I've more or less said that already. So look at the mercs, the mutagens, the endocrine disrupting chemicals, the reproductive toxins, and the carcinogens. I'm not going to go through this, I'm just going to skip through these. You can look at these. Endocrine disrupting chemicals are very toxic in very small amounts, parts per trillion, and they can have massive effects on the development of a fetus and on eggs and sperm and on all of our health really, and they're not being measured or looked at. Size matters very, very much, and it's hard to visualize, so that gives you a way of looking at that. And then this diagram shows you what happens when that gets into your body, how your body responds to that, how it tries to stop the smallest particles getting down into the lower parts of your lungs, being absorbed through the blood and getting all over the body, and they are toxic with, there's no safe threshold. The Hazards campaign and Hazards Magazine have campaigns against trying to reduce the level of silica, and there's a very big campaign, and Unite and GMB are also involved in trying to reduce exposures to diesel fumes. So there's lots of information on all of those. So when you're doing this sort of work, it's good to go for some easier wins, be creative, bear in mind that pitfalls, you might, as Andy has said, you might avoid exposure to one sort of hazard and put in place another chemical which actually has a different sort of hazard. So you must look out for that. But things like stopping the idling of vehicles, moving the fleet from diesel to electric, checking the ventilation systems, banning air fresheners, substituting non-volatile vegetable oil cleaners for organic solvents or water, substituting solids for powders, meeting online, all those sorts of things will help. So we will need to talk in a bit when we all get together. We need to talk about what we start to do. But this is the beginning of a discussion about toxic use reduction with members in your workplace, within the union, sectors and structures. We need to audit, process and make inventories. We need to know what we know and what we need to know. We need to use the existing law, but we need to work out what else we need. We need to demand good ventilation and air filtration. We need to make clear we're linking workplace exposure with climate change and zero carbon targets, air pollution limits and other pollution and green issues, which actually may help us more than some of the workplace health and safety laws and structures. And we need to ramp up the campaign on specific chemicals, asbestos, silica, particulates, and so on. We need to campaign for stricter laws. Andy's talked about the possibility of getting a Toxic Use Reduction Act in Scotland and Wales. We don't give up on that. We should be pushing that as well. And for better health-based exposure limits, bans on the more toxic chemicals, stricter enforcement of COSH, particularly the elimination and substitution. And we need to campaign across our unions with that. We'll have to work really hard on that. And we need to start sectoral discussions and development of campaigns for changes in the processes. One workplace won't be able to do a lot of this sort of stuff because there will be competition issues. But it's important that we start having those discussions and putting pressure on employers, on suppliers, on clients to reduce toxic chemicals and to develop safer alternatives for green chemistry to be involved. And we need full life cycle analysis of the health and safety hazards of all the products and processes, from conception to what happens when they're disposed of and possibly reused, so that we can have a clean circular economy. We can't do that at the moment because so many toxins are ending up in the waste. And we need to campaign around toxic use reduction at source at work, centered on improving workers' health and safety. That's what we're really trying to do. And in the presentation, there are lots of links for all of this, but we're at the beginning of a process here, and we hope to hear a lot more from you and start some good work on this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hilda. That's a brilliant presentation. Yes, Ian.
Thanks, Janet. I think one of the things that I attended a recent STUC and Hazardous joint training course over a 4-day period, and we're talking about enforcement, procurement, etc., and you know, the regulatory bodies as well. And I happen to make a suggestion that one of the things I think that where we could improve is if we actually had a HSE trade union liaison officer in each district or each region that was known to workplace health and safety reps, because at the moment it's a hit and a miss as to who you actually get, you know, who you can communicate depending on what areas that you're with. I do know that the HSE had a trade union liaison officer in Scotland. They had one, and that was about 4 years ago. He was stationed up in Aberdeen, but I don't know what the situation is now. That might be one way that you know, we were, the STUC and Hazardous were looking at pushing that forward.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. And you know, we used to say on the trade union courses, we probably still do on the trade union courses, Nigel, say make contact with your local health and safety executive officer, you know, and you know, so you get to know them and you can get a personal relationship with them, and you can, you know, that you can then get hold of them. But now, you know, the telephone numbers have been taken off the website. Really difficult to get to know who's going to come. I mean, through COVID, we've got these debt collectors that are doing spot checks that are, you know, haven't got the expertise of health and safety. So there's a whole different lot of issues, you know, and I think that's absolutely, it'd be good to be able to use leverage in Scotland and Wales and try and, you know, force that position where we've got contacts and we know who's going to be dealing with the issues in our workplaces, and then be able to advise. But I think probably going back to the point that was made by Dean, you know, we need to know who's got the expertise in these situations, you know, who's got the information, who we should be dealing with. And the point that Helen made about the NGO group, we have been trying on the TUC National Health and Safety Committee to set up a group around the chemicals. We've got one on asbestos, but to try and set up one around chemicals, because, you know, so that trade unions at national level can get together and have a point of view on it and look at how we can put pressure on the HSC and other bodies, you know, and UK REACH, and to protect workers. So that's another area that we need to be looking at. Any other points that you want to make or ask questions about, or anything else that came out of your groups that you want to raise? Yes,
yeah,
John.
I think we need more information. Andrew pointed out a couple of things to me that I didn't know. Tory, for instance, and also the green chemicals, I think it was. I've never heard of either of them, but they'll be a great help to me. And it's getting that information to people that's crucial, because we don't really know at the moment, and we need to be informed better, really.
Yeah, thanks, John. I think that's useful, and hopefully out of the toolkit that we're looking at producing, that sort of information would come out, you know, and give workers a bit more direction, really, and reps more direction as to what we can do or where they should go for the information. Anything else that you want to raise before I bring the speakers back in? This isn't the end, by the way. So what I mean is not the end, is that you can contact us at any time in the future or any time. You've got my email, and I can pass the information on to the speakers and get me information back to you as well. Caroline, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, it was just a point because we had Nigel in our group about how many reps are still able to go on trade union training, particularly COSH courses, and how much those could be used as a very practical way of helping reps. I mean, I know it's a long time since I did a COSH course, but I know it was very useful in practical terms, but perhaps trying out the toolkit that's going to be produced, getting people to help each other out with finding out about the chemicals. So it's doing what COSH courses do or what trade union courses do, but perhaps just doing it a bit more in a way that people can even more practically take back to their workplaces. But I'm not really sure how easy it is nowadays for health and safety reps and stewards to get the time off to attend trade union courses. I suspect it's more difficult than it used to be.
So I suppose before I bring Nigel in, if he wants to answer, I mean, what we need is, you know, what's the content of the COSH courses? Is there something that needs updating in them? You know, they were produced many years ago, and is there something that needs to be improved? Nigel, did you want to come in and say anything?
Yeah, I'm happy to come back in. Yeah, I think COSH courses are something that we've not run actually for a number of years through the college, but it is something that maybe we do need to kind of put back on the table. And I think one of the reasons is that, if I'm being honest, we've moved away from teaching those kind of courses, and we've shifted our focus more to kind of mental health, if I'm being honest, and we deliver so many more mental health type courses because that was where the demand was coming from. I think one of the things that we'd need to look at if we were going to kind of re-establish and start running the COSH courses again, we would need to do, you know, a real upskilling of us as tutors so that we were aware of which is why I've come on the conference today, to be honest, to kind of find out more myself, so I feel more confident in talking about it. And I think going back to John's comments within our group was really useful. You know, tapping into this knowledge, tapping into the expertise that we've got within the movement, and, you know, to get people to come along and share that knowledge and expertise so that we can explain in simple terms to our reps, these are the kind of things that you need to be looking out for. I think that would be the most helpful way that we could take it forward, Janet.
Thanks, Nigel. I think that's really useful. Hilda, do you want to come back on anything?
Sorry, is this the ending? Is this the
Yes,
rounding up bit? Yeah, I just think that's been absolutely brilliant. I think I think what has come out of today, what people have said, gives us clear sort of ways to go forward. You know, producing a toolkit, helping to improve training for TUC reps, getting onto TUC courses, providing you know, lists and access to information, try to make it easier for safety reps in the workplace to actually take action against this. And I just like to say that it's really, really important that we all realize that our exposure, workers' exposure to chemicals, is actually far greater than most people realize. It's far more harmful to every aspect of our lives. It's not only making us ill, it's shortening our lives, it's affecting our children, and it's linked up with all the other crises that we're facing. And the really important thing for us to do is to take hold of this and center our action around climate change and pollution, air pollution, plastic pollution, zero carbon attitude, is to center it all around making workplaces safer and healthier for workers and reducing all toxic substances at source in the workplace so that they don't get out there when it's absolutely impossible to work there or incredibly difficult to actually control them. But that's really has to be the focus, and I think I'd like that to become, you know, a very big thing, like mental health. Quite for all very obvious reasons, it has become a much bigger thing. I think I'd like us to realize that chemicals affect our mental health as well, but chemical exposure is an absolutely massive thing, and it is causing us all a lot of harm, and we have to get on top of it.
Yeah, thanks, Hilda. Andy, do you want to say anything?
Yeah, obviously lots of strands, really important strands, and trying to knit them together is going to be critical. Just thinking though of the workplace focus, I mean, what we've got with toxic use reduction strategies in a workplace is something that's very doable. And it's something that, picking up particularly what Helen and others were saying, it makes the link. It makes the link between the hazards that workers face. It's going to benefit customers. It's going to benefit patients if you're in a hospital setting. It's going to benefit consumers, and it's going to benefit the community. And the sort of initiatives that the trade unions have had over air pollution, that's gained a lot of traction recently, and quite rightly so, makes that link, you know, that who can be against it? You know, I mean, everybody's for goodness and against evil. Well, there's a lot of goodness in toxic use reduction, particularly when employers can make money out of it, reduce overheads, keep the workers at work and not make them sick. So I think having a workplace strategy that looks at perhaps small gains, you know, picking out 1 or 2 substances, 1 or 2 processes will be really important. And no sensible employer would really be against it. So perhaps having a strategy in the workplace on toxic use reduction is worthwhile.
Thanks, Andy. Bud, would you like to have the last word?
Yeah, I mean, it's been really useful. It's given me a lot of food for thought, but I think what we need to think about is, above all, the most important thing is union organisation, actually. That's what has the biggest influence on everything. If you're in a poorly organised workplace, it's harder for you to get gains. Where we've got really good union organisation, we see massive gains being made by our members and their reps and so on. Second thing I say is about HSE. It's very easy to knock HSE, and they're underfunded. There's not enough of them. There's still a few people in there who are quite trade union minded and good. But what I would say is, don't underestimate HSE information, because what I find is the vast majority of employers are ignorant of what they're meant to do and what exists. They don't know what the law is. They don't know what guidance is. One of my jobs is putting in the hands of reps basic HSE information about chemicals, substances, because they can use that to make changes. Employers are frightened of stuff from HSE. I mean, for all we know about HSE, it's fine, but they still, a lot of employers fear HSE. So if you've got an HSE document that says you should have done a risk assessment on all your chemicals, you can use that to influence your employer. So don't forget that. The other thing is, employers, if you talk about to employer about a Toxic Use Reduction Act, they'll just ignore you, because what they'll, the vast majority will, what they'll concentrate on is, what is the existing law? Am I breaking the law? And I mean, the number of employers I deal with who say, well, we'll do what the law requires, but nothing else. And, you know, fortunately, a lot go beyond that, but there are still a few steps. So knowing the law is important. And reps can know the law better than their employer. And that's a key kind of negotiating position to be in. Hilda mentioned individualization of problems. And so we've got the curse of well-being. Now, no one's going to argue that well-being isn't a good thing, because, you know, obviously it is. But we've got a huge number of employers who do well-being. HR departments do well-being, and it's all about lifestyle, individual stuff. They're not doing work-related ill health. And so, you know, we need to make that clear distinction. That's the other message. And at the moment, it's a huge tide that we're facing of employers going overboard on well-being. And sadly, the excuse that's often used is about mental health, because mental health kind of fits into the well-being box. But that doesn't mean everything else to do with well-being is kind of the right thing to do. And as someone said to me, well, it's no good giving people lettuce at lunchtime and then exposing them to carcinogens all afternoon. You know, so you kind of have to get the thing into the right context. Maybe that's the other thing I think to do, is to try and focus and simplify things. I mean, Hilda is absolutely right about all the things that need to happen. Not all those things can be done by workplace reps. Workplace reps need to think about what really affects them and what they can change and what they can do. And it might be concentrating on 1 or 2 chemicals or 1 or 2 processes and trying to fix them, because that might be more within your scope of action. And because if you're successful with 1 or 2 of those things, you can move on to other things. So that's the other thing, is it's good for everyone to read up about all sorts of stuff, find out what's going on in the world, but try and focus on your workplace and what you can change. And it might be a massive victory for many would be simply getting a decent ventilation system put in place to remove things. So I think that's the thing that reps should do. And sadly, I think different things affect different people. I think one of my jobs, and perhaps have failed to do it, is to get more about the way we get involved at different levels, the way we kind of campaign for various laws and acts and whatever. But I think in the current climate, I mean, what interests me most, and I don't have a magic answer yet, is are the things we can do to COSH, for instance, to make it more like a toxic use reduction act. I mean, there are things in COSH that would be part of that. Maybe we should accentuate them in the first place. Can we amend things slightly to make it better? Because we've got more chance in the short term of getting there, where our long-term aim may be to get trade union, toxic use reduction acts. I think our other issue is, I mean, I suppose, I don't think it's going to happen, but in theory, the fact we're not in Europe anymore means there are certain laws that could be changed in the UK. I don't think they are going to be changed because the government's not going to do it. But it, in a strange way, it gives us some opportunities. I think I'd rather be back in Europe overall because I think there'd be more benefits. But I think those are the kind of things we're looking at. But workplace reps need to think about what can they do in their workplace. Because that's the starting point, really, is to make those things better.
Thanks, Bud. And absolutely, I think that we agree, what do we need to concentrate on? I would just come back to the toxic use reduction issue, and law. And if it becomes law in Scotland and Wales, if they can do anything more on that, then certainly that would give us leverage in the rest of the UK to be able to go down that road and to support the work that we do. I'd just like to thank everybody for, especially the speakers, for the contributions this morning, but everybody for your contributions. This is the start of, or the beginning of the work that we want to do. And we hope that agree that there's a huge amount of work that we could do to improve our situations now, in terms of giving reps the information and working with trade unions to support them to do that, but also in sharing successes. What is going on in different workplaces that you could take up in your own workplace would be really helpful and give you some leverage with your own employers to do more about it. So watch this space. We've got a lot of things that we want to do, and we'll get the information out to you, and we'll be contacting you in the future about what we've done and whether you think it's useful or not, and what more we can do. Ultimately, I think, as all the speakers have said, this work will prevent future harm of workers by reducing or removing exposures of hazardous substances, and that's not just for the workers but their family members as well. And I'm mindful of what Carol said at the beginning of the meeting, whose husband died probably most definitely from exposures to chemicals, hazardous chemicals in the workplace, and that's where we don't want to end up. So we've got a lot to do on that. And as Hazardous magazine said, whether it's viruses, chemicals or pollution, breathing deadly substances shouldn't be all in a day's work. So let's make sure it isn't. So thank you very much for your contributions and for joining us. And if you want any more information, come back to us in the future. So thanks very much. See you all. Bye-bye.
Thanks, John.
Thank you. Bye.